All right, biodiversity and ecosystems. All right, so today we're going to be looking at what biodiversity is and how biodiversity affects the sustainability of an ecosystem. Sustainability, like the ability of an ecosystem to remain stable. All right, so the ability of an ecosystem to remain and of life despite changing conditions is called sustainability. So, how much an ecosystem's ability to withstand threats, such as predators that are new to the area. That's going to be how sustainable it is. Maybe a natural disaster, things like that are going to be able to affect its sustainability. All right, so the ecosystem sustainability, um, the variety of living things is known as biodiversity. So if you break it down with bio meaning life and diversity meaning different. So how much biodiversity an ecosystem has depends on the number and variety of species in that ecosystem. All right, so what is biodiversity? So biodiversity is the variety of life both within a particular species and between the different types of species. So what that really means is some birds, right? They might be the same species of birds, but they have different adaptations, right? Different variety. Birds that are all the same species of birds, but may have different coloration or beak length or something of that sort would be variety and biodiversity. Recap time. Explain how the biodiversity within an ecosystem helps maintain the sustainability. What would happen to an ecosystem that had very little biodiversity? So if you didn't have a variety of species, what would happen to that ecosystem? All right, so species diversity is the number of different species of plants and animals that live in an ecosystem. The more variety of species, the more organisms there will be in the food chains and food webs. And that makes an ecosystem more stable and less likely to be disrupted. So if you have like the Amazon rainforest, right? Millions of species, right? Undiscovered species too that live there. And so if you have an intricate food web of millions of species, if you lose one species, it's not going to really affect the sustainability of that ecosystem. Whereas like the tundra that has very few species, if one thing like lichen stopped existing there, which is one of the only plants that grows in those conditions, it's going to possibly collapse the entire ecosystem. All right, so a species diversity, an increase or reduction in a particular species changes the ecosystem. An ecosystem that's stable will have more ability to tolerate the change. When diversity is low, that's going to make that ecosystem weak, like we talked about with the tundra. All right, so let's look at the food chain over here on the right. What would happen to the ducks if the snails were wiped out by disease? Obviously, if the duck's only food source is a snail, and all snails are susceptible to some sort of disease, and they all die off, what's the duck going to eat? He can't eat algae because that's not what he eats. That's not something that's in his food palette, if you will. So, with more species in the food web, the outcome for the ducks may not be the same. If he has something else to eat, it'd be a little bit better for him. All right, so here's a food web, so an ecosystem with more biodiversity. So if the snails were gone, what could he eat now? Oh, there's some delicious mosquito larvae there that he could munch on, and then hopefully that would help sustain his population. All right, so genetic material, also known as DNA. It's genetic diversity is the variety of all the genetic material that's present in organisms. So it makes species more able to cope with changes in the environment. If you have a variety of different attributes, right, like it gives you more ability to give rise to adaptations, which will allow you to survive and reproduce. And then eventually, if you have some adaptations that are beneficial, Those animals that have those adaptations survive and reproduce and pass those on to the offspring, and then that's how changes in a species happens over time. Recap time! Why is biodiversity of genetic material, DNA, important to the stability of ecosystems? And if an ecosystem has a very large food web, is there a large effect or small effect on the ecosystem if you remove one species? Please explain. So right about now, you might be asking yourself, why is biodiversity important? Well, I have some answers for you. Biodiversity keeps ecosystems healthy and stable, and it allows them to function. They keep gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide in the air stable. And we've talked about before, too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere heats it up, and that's actually a negative. It helps recycle nutrients by decomposition. It keeps our climate stable because, again, more CO2 raises the temperature on Earth. And it keeps the Earth stable by controlling the amount of erosion. So ecosystems are also very important in how we carry on with our day-to-day lives. Plants and animals obviously provide us with food, shelter, fuel, materials, clothing, all sorts of medicines. All right, so preserving biodiversity. Biodiversity of ecosystems is obviously essential to preserve the quality of life we have on Earth. A lot of the medications that we have come from plants. We get a lot of that from plants, from the herbs and things from plants, and some of the chemicals from plants. So if we start to lose plant species, we could then lose, medicine, which then would give us less quality of life. Recap time gives several reasons explaining why biodiversity is so very important to an ecosystem. All right, so threats to biodiversity, you guessed it. Number one threat, humans. Because we are selfish and rude a lot of times, and we don't think about that. We just think about ourselves, not about our beautiful Earth. And global warming is one of the huge impacts because of the release of all the carbon dioxide emissions, CO2 emissions, into the atmosphere. The Earth's temperature is warming. It's very, very slow, a slow warmth. But even think about it, if ice melts, if it gets over certain temperature, 32 degrees, and it's slowly raising. Once it's going to get to that at some point if we don't do something. All the polar ice caps are going to melt, and the consequences to the climates could be extremely severe. All right, so some more threats to biodiversity. So we are changing the varieties of species through advances in genetics and selective breeding. Like we can breed two different animals together, like two different, same species, but maybe to form a better adaptation or a more pleasant looking animal, like we do with dogs to get the kind of desired dog we want. But sometimes the problem is we introduce that species into a ecosystem that it's not familiar with, and that can cause overpopulation of that. So we have the gray squirrel, which was introduced to the United Kingdom, and now outnumbers the British red squirrel because when an organism is introduced to a new environment, it doesn't have any natural predators because the predators don't know what that is because it's different than anything they've ever seen. And so they don't think it's a food source. And so then there's going to be overpopulation because no predators equals winter. Final recap time. The introduction of new species to a habitat could never be a cause of reduced biological diversity. Is this statement true or false? Please explain your reasoning.